Hey guys, I'm the Comics Kid 2099. I wanted to talk about a book I finished reading the other night. As I record this, it was the other night. This is called Nightwing, Old Friends, New Enemies. This is a collection of stories from the 1980s. For a brief period of time, Action Comics, which you probably know as the secondary or primary home of Superman, for a brief period of time, it was an anthology series in the 1980s, and it was weekly. So you had, like, for example, Nightwing, he was appearing in these 5 or 6 page stories in Action Comics. So you'd have a 22-page comic book with maybe 4 stories in it. And then these stories would last 6 or 7 issues, but they were reasonably short. They might actually last a little longer than 6 or 7 issues. This book collects 2 of these storylines, so it's only about 150 pages. It's not incredibly long. I don't know if there was more Nightwing stuff before or after this. I'm assuming this was the beginning. I looked online and I could not find any other Nightwing trades that were not from his solo series. Speaking of his solo series, if you are looking for that, this is not that. This is much more of a Teen Titans story than an actual Nightwing story from the 90s. This has nothing to do with Bloodhaven. It doesn't really mention Batman that much either. There is a story at the very beginning of this set on an alien world. I think it's around the time when the Teen Titans were on some alien world and Starfire was getting married, and Dick Grayson is talking to Jericho, Joe Wilson, and he's talking about kind of his origin story, talking about how his split with the Batman happened, and I had never actually seen the split happen. I did read Nightwing Year 1, which was kind of a retcon on the split, but I had never seen the pre-crisis split happen, and this kind of explains it and puts it in a really good, interesting spin. There were some things that were discussed in this origin story that I had never really thought of, especially the part where Dick is talking about even before he actually puts on the costume of Nightwing, he and Bruce were basically done even before that. As far back as Dick going to college, which I think in real world time, that was in the 1970s, there was a time where he had his own solo adventures where he was in college. According to this book, as far back as then, he and Batman had kind of already split up at that point, even though technically he didn't split off from him until he became Nightwing. Another way that this is much more like the Teen Titans, in the 1980s, Nightwing was much more of a Teen Titans character than he was a Batman character. In the 80s, he was a regular character in Teen Titans, and he wasn't really appearing in the Batman stories all that much. Now, when you got to the 1990s, before he had his own solo series, I think in the Teen Titans series, whoever was writing at the time, it might have been toward the end of Marv Wolfman's run, they had Nightwing basically sever his ties with the Teen Titans, and then when he got his own solo series, he was much more in the Batman family once again. He would show up in Gotham every now and then in some of the big crossovers. He showed up, like the Nightfall stuff and the War Game stuff. He would show up even though he had his own stuff going on in Bloodhaven. He was a little bit more closely associated with the Bat family than he was in the 1980s. And also, I say this is more of a Teen Titans book because this is really Nightwing and Speedy teaming up. Both of these stories have Speedy, Roy Harper. Both of them have Speedy and Nightwing working together. And the second story is even more of a Speedy story than a Nightwing story. I would say this book probably could have been called Teen Titans, Old Friends, New Enemies, and I think nobody would have batted an eye. Now, it didn't have the full Teen Titans team. They do appear sporadically in this. I think Starfire, she shows up at the very end of both stories, and we do get a very brief instance where Nightwing is kind of having a conference call with the rest of the team, but other than that, this is Nightwing and Speedy teaming up. And honestly, I think this would have worked as a Teen Titans trade, even though it didn't happen in the Teen Titans book. I think it is a Teen Titans story through and through. As far as the stories themselves, are they good? I would say the first story is better than the second story. The first story is basically Cheshire, who is Speedy's baby mama. She is out killing politicians in Great Britain, and Nightwing and Speedy try to stop her, and then Speedy has an ulterior motive where he is trying to get his daughter back, and the story ends, spoiler, with him getting his daughter back. And then that was part of Speedy's status quo for a long time. I know in the 2000s he had his daughter still, so for a long time time, that was part of Speedy's thing. So this book is very important because it puts Roy on that path that he will be on until the mid or late 2000s whenever Leon was killed. So the first story is also pretty simple. There's not really a whole lot of complexity to it. It's basically Nightwing and Roy trying to stop Cheshire from killing people, and then they get Roy's daughter at the end. It's also written by Marv Wolfman, and it's pretty good, and it also makes sense that Wolfman would be writing this story because he was writing Teen Titans for like 15 years or something like that. And so it makes sense when you have kind of this satellite book that's sort of a Teen Titans book, but it's its own thing also. It makes sense that you would have the guy writing Teen Titans write this other story. The second story, not as good. For one thing, it feels really complex. You have Roy going to Ireland. He wants to discover his roots, and he also wants Leon to have a happy life away from superheroics and stuff like that. Almost before they even get to Ireland, in fact, there is no almost, before they get to Ireland, Nightwing and Roy are on a boat, and stuff starts happening. Honestly, I wouldn't be able to explain it. I read this stuff very recently, and even I'm a little confused about it. There was drug running involved with the CBI, which was basically the FBI, but a fictional organization that Roy briefly worked for, and the Teen Titans character Danny Chase, he also worked for them. The CBI was involved with running drugs and guns into Ireland. There was at least 2 organizations in Ireland. There was the FOES, there was the Friends of the Empire, there was the Santas, which was like a gang, and they were all against each other, and it was really hard for me to keep track of who is a good guy, who is a bad guy. I think part of that, the problem was, at one point, all of these organizations were all gunning for Roy, and so it was really hard for me to keep track of who is an actual friend and who is an enemy. And I think this story was not the kind of story that you needed to tell in a weekly series where each installment is 5 or 6 pages long. If you wanted to do an original graphic novel that was maybe 200 pages long, you could do a complex story involving politics spread out across Ireland and America. But when you have roughly 60 pages, you really don't have the room to tell that kind of story. Wolfman also writes the second story, at least part of it. He starts writing, and then about halfway through, he's co-plotting, and then the other person writing is Cherry Wilkerson, and then she starts writing the whole thing without any assistance from Wolfman. And I don't know if that's the reason that this story is not as good, because there were too many chefs in the kitchen, if you will, but usually when you have more than one writer working on a single story, and then one of them takes over for the other one, usually that doesn't really work out for me. Usually it's pretty easy to tell, oh, okay, they're doing an entirely different thing than what that other person was doing, even though this is all supposed to be one seamless story. That may have been a problem here, but also I think, like I said earlier, this story just wasn't long enough to explore the ideas and themes that were presented in this story. Overall, would I recommend this book? Absolutely. If you are a fan of Nightwing or Speedy from the Teen Titans, definitely get this. If you just want to read some old school stuff from the 1980s, I would suggest doing this. This is some really solid stuff for the most part. Even the second story, it's pretty good. It's a lot more complex than the first story, and I think that is its big drawback, but it's still a decent read. And as long as you're keeping yourself pretty sharp and paying attention, it's not going to throw you for a loop. It's going to be a pretty good read for you. And also, I'm a fan of the Teen Titans, I'm a fan of Batman, so that had something to do with it, but I definitely think this is something that just about anyone could read. This is not really connected to a lot of stuff that happened outside of it, so other than being a little bit familiar with who Batman is and who his Robins are, that's really all the knowledge that you would need to read this book. So I definitely recommend that you go and get this book. I would really like to see DC do more of this. If there was more Nightwing and Speedy adventures in Action Comics Weekly, I would like to see another trade. I don't know if there was more material outside of these 2 stories, though. I think there was, but since I haven't read a lot of Action Comics from that time period, I can't be certain. But I would definitely like to see a lot more of this done in trades. So go out and buy a copy, and then DC will get the message, hey, people like this stuff, let's put out more. And that's about all I have to say about this book. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope that I was able to convince you to go and buy this book, or maybe if I didn't convince you, then hopefully this video was still helpful for you in some way. I'll be coming back later in the week with a different kind of video, so until then, I'll see you guys later. Have a great day.